On a cold spring morning in 1927, a farmer stood beside a muddy field in the Mississippi Delta and looked toward the horizon. Nothing seemed unusual. The sky was gray. The wind was calm. Birds drifted across the distant tree line. To anyone passing by, it looked like another ordinary day in the American South. But beneath that quiet landscape, a disaster was already forming. Not in a single town. Not in a single state. But across nearly half of the United States. Thousands of miles away, rain was falling. And it had been falling for weeks. No one standing in that field could see it. No one could hear it. Yet every drop was moving toward him. Every creek. Every stream. Every river. Every flooded valley. All of it was feeding one giant system. The Mississippi River. And before the year was over, that river would unleash one of the greatest natural disasters in American history. A disaster so large that entire towns would disappear. Hundreds of thousands of people would lose everything. And the United States would never look at its rivers the same way again. But to understand how it happened, we have to go back to a time when Americans believed they had finally conquered nature. For thousands of years, the Mississippi River had shaped North America. Long before highways. Long before railroads. Long before the United States even existed. The river was already there. Flowing more than 2,000 miles from the northern interior of the continent to the Gulf of Mexico. It drained water from a vast portion of North America. By the early 20th century, the Mississippi had become one of the most important transportation routes in the country. Cotton moved along it. Timber moved along it. Food moved along it. Industry depended on it. Entire cities depended on it. The river was not merely a body of water. It was an economic lifeline. But it was also dangerous. Every generation living near the Mississippi had stories about floods. Stories of rising water. Destroyed farms. Lost livestock. And towns swallowed by muddy currents. Yet by the 1920s, many Americans believed those days were ending. Engineers had spent decades constructing levees. Huge walls of earth designed to keep the river inside its banks. Year after year, those levees grew larger. Stronger. Higher. Whenever a flood threatened, engineers responded with more construction. More reinforcement. More confidence. Eventually, a dangerous idea began spreading. The idea that the Mississippi had been controlled. That humanity had won. That technology had defeated nature. And when people believe they have defeated nature, they often stop respecting it. Throughout much of 1926, conditions appeared normal. Farmers planted crops. Riverboats traveled predictable routes. Business flourished. There was little reason to believe disaster was approaching. Then winter arrived. And with it came rain. At first, no one worried. Rain was common. Necessary even. Farmers welcomed it. The land needed moisture. The rivers needed replenishment. But the rain continued. Week after week. Storm after storm. Across enormous portions of the country. The ground became saturated. Small creeks overflowed. Streams widened into rushing channels. The soil could absorb no more water. Every new storm added pressure to a system already under strain. By early 1927, meteorologists were becoming concerned. Although weather forecasting was primitive compared to modern standards, observers knew something unusual was happening. Rainfall totals were reaching extraordinary levels. Records were being broken. And still, the storms continued. Across states like Missouri, Illinois, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana, rivers began climbing higher. Communities watched water levels with increasing anxiety. People who lived near rivers noticed changes. The water seemed faster, darker, more aggressive. Yet most still believed the levees would hold. After all, they always had. In February, conditions worsened. Tributaries feeding the Mississippi grew dangerously swollen. The Ohio River rose. The Arkansas River rose. The Red River rose. Countless smaller waterways overflowed. Each one contributed additional pressure. The Mississippi was becoming overloaded, like a giant machine operating beyond its limits. Yet the true scale of the threat remained difficult to comprehend. The Mississippi River Basin covers an enormous area. What happened hundreds of miles away could eventually affect communities far downstream. Many residents focused only on local conditions. They could not see the full picture. They could not see the water gathering across vast portions of the continent. They could not see the disaster assembling itself piece by piece. As March arrived, fear began replacing confidence. River gauges showed alarming numbers. Officials monitored levees constantly. Engineers traveled between vulnerable locations. Newspapers published updates. People gathered in stores and train stations discussing water levels. Farmers stood near riverbanks studying the current. Many had witnessed floods before. But something felt different this time. The river seemed alive, restless, growing stronger each day. In some places, families quietly prepared emergency plans. Not because they expected catastrophe, but because experience taught them caution. They moved valuables to higher shelves. They checked boats. They discussed evacuation routes, just in case. Still, few imagined what was actually coming. Then came April. And with it, one of the wettest periods ever recorded in parts of the United States. Torrential rain hammered the region. Rivers surged. Levees groaned under immense pressure. Day after day, water continued rising. Reports arrived from multiple states. Flooding was spreading. Conditions were deteriorating. Some communities were already isolated. Yet officials continued assuring the public. The levee system would hold. The river could be contained. There was no need for panic. Many people wanted to believe those reassurances, because the alternative was terrifying. If the levees failed, there would be nowhere to hide. On certain nights, residents living near the river struggled to sleep. They could hear the water. Not waves. Not splashes. Something deeper. A constant roar. A reminder that unimaginable amounts of water were pressing against walls of earth. Waiting. Testing. Searching for weakness. Engineers worked around the clock. Sandbags were delivered. Crews inspected levees. Repairs were made wherever possible. But the river kept rising. And nature does not become less dangerous because humans are working hard. Sometimes it becomes more dangerous because humans are running out of time. By mid-April, tension filled the Mississippi Valley. Entire communities watched the river every day. Business slowed. Normal life felt suspended. People sensed history approaching, even if they could not yet define it. Churches held special prayers. Families discussed evacuation plans more seriously. Local officials prepared emergency responses. The atmosphere changed. Confidence faded. Anxiety replaced it. Because everyone could see the same thing. The river was still rising. And no one knew where the limit was. Then, in the darkness before dawn, the first major signs of failure appeared. A levee inspector walking along an embankment noticed something unusual. Water. Not flowing over the levee. Flowing through it. Tiny streams emerged from the earth itself. At first, they seemed harmless. Small leaks. Nothing dramatic. But experienced engineers understood the danger immediately. Those leaks meant pressure was building inside the structure. The river was beginning to win. And once that process started, stopping it became extraordinarily difficult. Messages were sent. Workers rushed to the area. Emergency repairs began. But the Mississippi River had spent months gathering strength. What was happening now had been building for a very long time. And soon, the entire nation would witness the consequences. For weeks, people across the Mississippi Valley had watched the river rise. Every morning, they checked the water. Every evening, they talked about it. And every night they listened. The sound had changed. The Mississippi no longer sounded like a river. It sounded like pressure. like something immense pushing against its limits. In towns scattered across Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, ordinary life had almost stopped. Farmers spent less time discussing crops and more time discussing water levels. Store owners gathered around newspapers searching for updates. Local officials moved from meeting to meeting, trying to reassure frightened residents. But beneath every conversation was the same unspoken fear. What if the levees failed? For decades, those walls of earth had stood between civilization and chaos. People trusted them because they had always been there. Children grew up seeing them. Families built homes behind them. Entire communities existed because those barriers existed. Few people ever stopped to consider what would happen if they disappeared. Then, one morning, the unimaginable happened. The first reports arrived quickly. A section of levee had failed. At first, the news seemed almost unbelievable. Levees occasionally suffered damage. Small breaches happened from time to time. Usually, repairs were made before disaster followed. But this was different. Very different. Witnesses later described hearing a deep rumbling sound. Some thought it was thunder. Others believed it was distant machinery. Then the ground began to shake. Not violently. Just enough to make people stop and look around. For a brief moment, everything seemed strangely still. Then the levee gave way. The river burst through with a force few had ever seen. It was not a stream of water. It was a wall. A moving, roaring mass carrying mud, debris, trees, and unimaginable power. People standing nearby had only seconds to react. Some ran. Others froze. Many simply stared in disbelief. Because the thing they trusted most had failed. And now nothing stood between them and the Mississippi River. Within minutes, water began spreading across farmland. Roads vanished beneath muddy currents. Fields disappeared. Fences collapsed. Livestock scattered in every direction. Farmers who had spent entire lifetimes building their properties watched helplessly as everything was swallowed. A barn that took years to construct could be destroyed in minutes. A family's savings could disappear before lunchtime. Generations of work vanished almost instantly. And the river was only beginning. News traveled quickly. Telephones rang constantly. Telegraph offices became overwhelmed. Local authorities sent urgent messages to neighboring towns. The warning was simple. Get out. Get out now. But evacuation was far easier to order than to accomplish. Many roads were already flooded. Transportation was limited. And thousands of people still believed the situation could not possibly become as bad as officials feared. History would prove otherwise. As the day continued, more levees began showing signs of weakness. Engineers rushed from one location to another. Workers piled sandbags. Emergency crews attempted repairs. Everyone understood the stakes. If additional levees failed, the disaster would spread exponentially. Yet the Mississippi River had become too large. Too powerful. Too full. Months of rainfall from across a vast portion of North America had combined into one unstoppable force. The system was overwhelmed. And nature was collecting its debt. Across the Delta region, residents started moving belongings to higher ground. Furniture. Clothing. Family photographs. Anything they could carry. Some loaded wagons. Others loaded trucks. Many simply carried possessions by hand. There was no time for careful planning. Only urgency. Only survival. Families separated during evacuations. Children were rushed away while parents stayed behind. Husbands promised wives they would follow later. Neighbors shouted final instructions to one another. Everywhere uncertainty ruled. No one knew what tomorrow would look like. Then another levee failed. And another. And another. Each collapse released enormous amounts of water into areas that had never been intended to hold it. Entire communities suddenly found themselves surrounded. The transformation was astonishing. Places that had been dry farmland in the morning became lakes by evening. Roads became rivers. Railroads became islands. Towns became isolated pockets of land trapped in a growing sea. People climbed onto rooftops. Church bells rang as emergency warnings. Dogs barked continuously. Horses struggled through rising water. The atmosphere felt less like a flood and more like the end of the world. One resident later described looking across the landscape and seeing nothing familiar. No roads. No fields. No boundaries. Only water. Water stretching to the horizon in every direction. It was as if the map itself had disappeared. And in many ways it had. The Mississippi Valley was being redrawn by nature. As conditions deteriorated, stories of extraordinary courage began emerging. A farmer used a small boat to rescue neighbors trapped in their home. A schoolteacher guided dozens of children to safety before returning to help others. Families risked their lives to save elderly relatives. Ordinary people performed extraordinary acts because there was no alternative. Disasters often reveal character. And across the Mississippi Valley, courage appeared everywhere. Not because people felt brave, but because someone had to act. The nights were the worst. Darkness hid the true extent of the disaster. People stranded on rooftops could hear water moving around them. They could hear structures collapsing in the distance. They could hear cries for help carried across the floodwaters. But they often could not see anything. Families huddled together under cold skies. Parents tried to comfort frightened children. Many had little food. Some had none. No one knew when rescue would arrive. Or if it would arrive. Hours felt like days. Days felt endless. Meanwhile, newspapers across the country began publishing dramatic headlines. The flood was no longer a regional story. It was national news. Americans in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles followed developments with growing concern. The scale of the disaster seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Entire counties underwater. Hundreds of thousands displaced. The nation's most important river system in open rebellion against human control. Readers struggled to imagine such scenes. For those living through them, imagination was unnecessary. Reality was terrifying enough. Soon, the American Red Cross launched what would become one of the largest relief operations in the nation's history. Boats, supplies, medical personnel, and volunteers poured into the region. Temporary refugee camps were established. Food distribution centers appeared. Emergency shelters opened. But even these massive efforts struggled to keep pace with the disaster. The numbers were simply too large. Too many people. Too much water. Too much destruction. Then came a moment that would define the entire catastrophe. A decision made far from the rooftops and refugee camps. A decision involving one of America's most important cities. New Orleans. Officials feared that if pressure continued building, the city itself could face disaster. The economic consequences would be enormous. The political consequences could be even greater. Behind closed doors, engineers and leaders debated desperate options. And eventually, they chose one. A choice that would save some communities and sacrifice others. A choice that remains controversial nearly a century later. Because to save New Orleans, someone else would have to pay the price. And soon, thousands of families would discover that they were the ones chosen to pay it. By the final days of April 1927, the Mississippi River was no longer simply flooding. It was dominating. For weeks, engineers, politicians, military officers, and emergency officials had watched the situation worsen. Every report arriving from the flood zone seemed more alarming than the last. Entire communities had vanished beneath water. Railroads were crippled. Agricultural regions were drowning. Hundreds of thousands of people were already displaced. And yet, despite all that destruction, many leaders feared something even worse was still ahead. Far downstream sat one of the most important cities in America. New Orleans. For generations, New Orleans had served as a gateway between the Mississippi River and the rest of the world. Cotton, grain, timber, and countless other goods flowed through its ports. The city was not merely important to Louisiana. It was important to the entire nation. If New Orleans suffered catastrophic flooding, the consequences could ripple across the American economy. And so a frightening question emerged. What if protecting New Orleans required sacrificing someone else? Inside government offices and engineering headquarters, discussions became increasingly tense. Maps covered tables. River measurements were studied day and night. Experts debated possibilities. Some believed the city could survive. Others were less confident. The river continued rising. Pressure continued building. And every passing day reduced the number of available options. Eventually, a proposal gained support. A controversial proposal. A dangerous proposal. A proposal that would change thousands of lives forever. The idea was simple. If the river could be given another place to go, pressure on New Orleans might be reduced. Engineers suggested intentionally destroying a levee south of the city. The resulting floodwater would spread across less populated areas. Those communities would suffer. But New Orleans might be spared. On paper, it appeared to be a calculation. A strategic decision. A choice between two bad outcomes. But maps do not show families. Maps do not show children sleeping in bedrooms. Maps do not show elderly couples sitting on porches built decades earlier. Maps reduce human lives to empty spaces. Reality is far more complicated. Word of the proposal began spreading. Many residents living near the targeted area could hardly believe it. Surely the government would not deliberately flood American communities. Surely there had to be another solution. But the discussions continued. And eventually, the decision was made. The levee would be destroyed. On April 29, 1927, workers prepared explosives. Officials gathered. Reporters watched. Tension filled the air. People understood they were about to witness something historic. Not because nature was acting, but because humans were. The charges were placed. Final preparations were completed. And then, the order was given. Moments later, a tremendous explosion shattered the morning air. The levee erupted. Earth flew outward. Dust filled the sky. And almost immediately, the Mississippi River surged through the opening. The force was extraordinary. Water exploded across the landscape. Fields vanished. Roads disappeared. Homes were overwhelmed. The flood spread rapidly through areas that had never expected to become part of the disaster. For families living there, the event felt surreal. One day they were watching reports about flooding elsewhere. The next day, the flood was coming directly toward them. Not because nature chose them. Because people did. Some residents fled before the water arrived. Others waited too long. Many simply had nowhere to go. As floodwaters spread, communities scrambled to evacuate. Wagons filled with belongings moved along crowded roads. Families carried whatever they could save. Photographs. Clothing. Religious items. Important documents. The small pieces of life people cling to when everything else is being lost. But no one could carry a house. No one could carry a farm. No one could carry years of memories. Those would remain behind, waiting for the water. As the flood expanded, refugee camps grew larger. Across the Mississippi Valley, enormous temporary settlements appeared. Rows of tents stretched across available high ground. Thousands of displaced people gathered together. Some had lost homes. Others had lost businesses. Many had lost both. Yet despite their shared circumstances, camp life was far from easy. Food was limited. Privacy was non-existent. Sanitation was difficult. Summer heat intensified every challenge. People who had once lived independently now depended upon relief organizations for survival. For proud families accustomed to supporting themselves, the adjustment was painful. Some felt grateful. Others felt humiliated. Most felt exhausted. Children adapted faster than adults. They often do. In many camps, young boys and girls found ways to play despite the circumstances. They chased one another between tents. Invented games. shared stories, laughed when they could. For brief moments, they created normality in places where normality no longer existed. Parents watched them with mixed emotions. Relief that their children could still smile. Sadness that they had to. Meanwhile, photographers documented the disaster. Images spread across newspapers nationwide. Americans saw families crowded into camps. Rows of tents stretching into the distance. Homes surrounded by endless water. Boats traveling where streets once existed. The photographs shocked the country. Many readers struggled to comprehend the scale. This was not a flood affecting a single town. This was a catastrophe affecting an entire region. The Mississippi River had transformed millions of acres into temporary ocean. As relief efforts expanded, one individual gained national attention. His name was Herbert Hoover. At the time, Hoover served as Secretary of Commerce. He quickly became one of the most visible leaders involved in coordinating relief operations. Newspapers frequently published stories about his efforts. Photographs showed him visiting affected areas, meeting officials, inspecting camps, overseeing aid distribution. To many Americans, Hoover appeared calm, organized, and effective. In a time of chaos, that image mattered a great deal. Few people realized it then, but the flood was helping shape the future of American politics. The visibility Hoover gained during the disaster would contribute significantly to his national reputation. And within a year, he would become President of the United States. But while political careers advanced, ordinary people remained focused on survival. The flood was not a headline to them. It was daily reality. Some families spent weeks in refugee camps. Others spent months. Many had no idea what awaited them when they eventually returned home. Had their houses survived? Were their farms still usable? Could their communities recover? No one knew. The uncertainty became its own form of suffering. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the river began retreating. Water levels stopped rising. Then they stabilized. Then they fell. Day by day. Inch by inch. The process was painfully slow. Yet after months of fear, even small signs of improvement brought hope. For the first time in a long while, people began talking about the future instead of the flood. But the future would bring its own challenges. Because when the water finally left, it revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition. And for hundreds of thousands of survivors, the hardest part of the disaster was still waiting. Going home. A farmer returning to his property might discover that his fields were buried beneath thick layers of mud and sand. A shop owner might find an empty shell where a business once stood. A family might return expecting damage and instead discover destruction. Entire neighborhoods looked unfamiliar. Landmarks had disappeared. Roads were gone. Trees had been uprooted. The flood had not simply covered the landscape. It had reshaped it. And rebuilding would require years. Not weeks. Not months. Years. Yet amid the devastation, something remarkable emerged. People refused to give up. Neighbors helped neighbors. Communities organized cleanup efforts. Churches coordinated assistance. Volunteers arrived from across the country. Again and again, individuals who had lost almost everything found ways to help others. It was one of the great lessons of the disaster. When systems fail, when plans collapse, and when nature demonstrates its power, ordinary people often become extraordinary. Not because they seek recognition, but because survival demands it. By the end of 1927, the floodwaters were mostly gone. But the Mississippi River had left behind something far more lasting than physical damage. It had changed the nation. Changed politics. Changed engineering. Changed migration patterns. Changed how Americans thought about disasters. And the consequences of those changes were only beginning. Because just 2 years later, a new catastrophe would arrive. A catastrophe that no levee could stop. A catastrophe that would affect every corner of the country. The Great Depression. And for flood survivors who had only begun rebuilding their lives, the timing could not have been worse. When the Mississippi River finally began to retreat in late 1927, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like exposure. For months, water had covered everything: roads, homes, farms, entire towns. And while the flood had been terrifying, it had also been familiar in a strange way. People understood what they were dealing with. They understood how to survive it. But when the water left, it revealed something far more difficult to face. What was gone could not easily be restored. Across the Mississippi Valley, families began the long journey back to what remained of their homes. Some traveled by boat through still flooded areas. Others walked long distances along damaged roads. Many simply returned to find out what had happened. And what they found often left them speechless. A house was still standing, but empty, stripped, and filled with mud. A farm was still there, but buried under layers of sand and debris. A town was still on the map, but barely recognizable in reality. The flood had not just damaged life. It had rewritten it. Inside homes that had survived structurally, the situation was often worse than expected. Walls were stained with thick mud lines showing exactly how high the water had risen. Furniture lay broken or completely destroyed. Food supplies had rotted. Personal belongings were either missing or unrecognizable. Family photographs, books, clothing, everything that gave a home its identity, had been consumed by time and water. The smell alone told the story. A mixture of damp earth, decay, and silence. For many families, the emotional impact was immediate. Some stood in shock. Some cried. Some simply turned around and walked away, unable to face what remained. In rural areas, the situation was even more severe. Entire farms had been reshaped by the flood. Topsoil, the foundation of agriculture, had been washed away in many regions. Fields that once produced cotton, corn, and rice were now layers of mud and sand. Fences were gone. Barns had collapsed. Livestock had been lost. And even where land remained, it was uncertain whether it could still be farmed. For farmers, this was not just property loss. It was the loss of identity. Their work. Their inheritance. Their future. As families struggled to recover, a new and unexpected crisis began forming beneath the surface. The financial system. Many farmers had taken loans before the flood. They had borrowed money to plant crops, expand land, or invest in equipment. But the flood had destroyed the very crops that were supposed to repay those loans. Now, even with land damaged or unusable, the debts still remained. Banks still demanded payment. Interest still accumulated. And for thousands of families, survival turned into financial pressure. Local businesses faced similar problems. Stores had been flooded. Inventory destroyed. Customers displaced or broke. Even in towns that were physically rebuilt, economic activity was weak. People had no money to spend. And businesses had nothing left to sell. Recovery, it became clear, was not just about rebuilding structures. It was about rebuilding an entire economy. Meanwhile, government officials began traveling across the region to assess the damage. The numbers they collected were difficult to believe. Hundreds of thousands displaced. Millions of acres affected. Thousands of homes destroyed. Infrastructure across multiple states severely damaged. And behind every number was a human story that could not be fully captured in reports. The scale of destruction forced a new understanding. This was not a local disaster. It was a national one. In Washington, discussions about responsibility intensified. Could anything have prevented this? Could better engineering have saved more land? Could earlier warnings have reduced the damage? And most importantly, what should be done to prevent it from happening again? Engineers and policymakers began rethinking everything they believed about flood control. The Mississippi River could no longer be treated as something that could simply be contained. It had to be managed differently. On a larger scale. With more flexibility. With more respect for its natural behavior. But while officials debated the future, people on the ground faced the present. And the present was difficult. Temporary shelters still housed thousands of displaced families. Some people had nowhere to return to at all. Others returned only to leave again, realizing rebuilding was impossible. Migration began quietly. Not dramatic. Not sudden. But steady. Families leaving the South in search of stability elsewhere. Northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis became destinations for those looking to start over. They were not chasing opportunity in the traditional sense. They were escaping uncertainty. Amid this ongoing struggle, one figure continued rising in national visibility. Herbert Hoover. His coordination of flood relief efforts placed him at the center of public attention. To many Americans, Hoover represented organization and leadership during chaos. His image was strengthened by newspaper coverage and public appearances. Few people realized how much this disaster would influence his political future. But the flood had already begun shaping his national reputation. And within a short time, that reputation would carry him to the presidency. Then, just as recovery efforts were slowly gaining momentum, a far greater crisis struck. In 1929, the American economy collapsed. The Great Depression began. For flood survivors, it felt like a second disaster arriving before the first had fully healed. First, nature had taken their homes. Now, the economy took their livelihoods. Banks failed. Jobs disappeared. Farm prices collapsed. And families that had barely recovered from the flood found themselves once again struggling to survive. But this time, there was no physical force to blame. No river to fight. Only a broken economic system that affected the entire country. The psychological impact was enormous. For many survivors, it felt like history was repeating itself. Just when stability seemed possible, everything collapsed again. Hope became fragile. Security became uncertain. And resilience became a necessity, not a choice. It was in this environment that Franklin D. Roosevelt rose to national leadership. He promised change. He promised action. And under his presidency, the New Deal began transforming the United States. Large-scale public works programs were introduced. Infrastructure was rebuilt. Jobs were created. And most importantly, the federal government took a much larger role in disaster response and economic recovery. One of the lasting outcomes of this era was a completely new approach to flood control. Engineers no longer believed that the Mississippi River could simply be restrained by higher levees alone. Instead, they developed a more complex system. Floodways to redirect excess water. Spillways to relieve pressure. Stronger, federally managed levee systems. A coordinated national strategy rather than isolated local defenses. It was a direct response to the failures revealed in 1927. As the 1930s progressed, the Mississippi River gradually returned to a more controlled flow. Cities rebuilt. Agriculture slowly recovered. Infrastructure improved. But the memory of the flood never disappeared. It remained in stories passed between generations. In photographs preserved from the disaster. In the quiet understanding of those who had lived through it. Because those who survived the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 learned something that stayed with them for life. That nature does not negotiate. It does not forget. And it does not stop. It only pauses. And when it returns, humanity must be ready. By the time the 1930s began to unfold, the waters of the Mississippi Flood of 1927 were long gone. The river had returned to its familiar path. Fields slowly began to grow again. Towns were rebuilt, sometimes in the same places, sometimes in completely new ones. From a distance, it looked like recovery. Like the worst had passed. But for the people who lived through it, something had changed permanently. The flood was no longer an event in their lives. It was part of them. Something carried forward quietly into everything that came after. Children who had once been lifted onto rooftops to escape rising water were now teenagers. Some could barely remember the flood in detail. But they remembered the feeling. The confusion. The noise. The waiting. The silence when everything familiar disappeared. Even those who were too young to remember directly grew up surrounded by stories. Parents spoke about the water the way people speak about war. Not often, but with weight, with seriousness, with memory that does not fade. In homes across the Mississippi Valley, the flood became a reference point for everything. A bad storm was compared to it. A difficult year was compared to it. A financial struggle was compared to it. For those who lived through it, nothing else quite reached the same level again. Because they had already seen what everything lost looked like. But while the emotional memory remained, life had to continue. Families rebuilt farms. Children returned to schools. Small businesses reopened. The Mississippi River flowed again as if nothing had happened. Yet beneath the surface, changes were still unfolding. Not in the river, but in the people. One of the most significant changes was migration. After the flood, thousands of families had made a decision they never expected to make. They left the South. Not all at once. Not in panic. But gradually, over years. They moved toward industrial cities in the North. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis. Places where work was available. Where stability seemed more likely. Where the river could not take everything away in a single season. This movement quietly reshaped American society. Communities changed. Cities expanded. Cultures mixed. And a new chapter of American life began forming in those northern industrial centers. Meanwhile, the Mississippi River itself remained both powerful and calm. It continued to support agriculture, transportation, and commerce. But engineers no longer treated it with confidence alone. They treated it with caution, respect, and constant observation. Because 1927 had proven something undeniable. Even the most advanced systems can fail when nature reaches its limit. By the mid-1930s, another crisis dominated American life. The Great Depression. For many flood survivors, it felt like a continuation of suffering rather than a new event. First came water. Then came economic collapse. Farmers who had rebuilt after losing crops now faced falling prices. Workers who had repaired homes now faced unemployment. Banks that had survived the flood now failed under financial pressure. It was as if instability had become a permanent condition of life. In this environment, a new political force emerged. Franklin D. Roosevelt. His message was simple, but powerful. The government must not only observe crises. It must respond to them. Under his leadership, the New Deal programs began reshaping the United States. Public works projects provided employment. Infrastructure was rebuilt across the country. And flood control became a national priority, not a local responsibility. Engineers studying the Mississippi River drew heavily from the lessons of 1927. They understood that no single barrier could contain such a massive system. So they redesigned the approach entirely. Instead of only trying to hold the river back, they began designing systems to guide it. Floodways that could redirect excess water. Spillways that could safely release pressure. Stronger, federally managed levees built with long-term planning. It was a shift in philosophy. From control to management. From confidence to caution. From assumption to preparation. But even as infrastructure improved, memory remained stronger than engineering. Those who had lived through the flood never fully trusted calm water again. A river could look peaceful. But they had seen what it could become. And that knowledge stayed with them for life. As the decade moved forward, a new generation began growing up. Children of survivors. Children who had never seen the flood themselves. But who had inherited its stories. Its warnings. Its lessons. They grew up in a world shaped by something they did not directly experience, yet deeply influenced their lives. Then came another turning point in American history. The world moved toward war. By the early 1940s, the United States entered World War II. And among the young men and women who joined the military or supported the war effort were those who had grown up in the aftermath of the Mississippi flood. They were not strangers to hardship. They had seen their parents rebuild from nothing. They had heard stories of survival, loss, and resilience. And those experiences shaped how they faced new challenges. In factories, they worked long hours producing aircraft, weapons, and supplies. In the military, they trained under difficult conditions and adapted quickly to pressure. Officers often noted their resilience, their discipline, their ability to remain calm in stressful situations. Whether or not they realized it, the flood had helped shape their character. It had taught them, early in life, that crisis is not rare. It is part of existence. When the war ended in 1945, the world had changed again. Entire nations had been destroyed and rebuilt. Borders had shifted. Millions had died. And the United States emerged as a global power. But for those shaped by the Mississippi flood, this was simply the latest in a series of world-altering events. Flood, depression, war. 3 massive disruptions within a single lifetime. Few generations in history had experienced such a sequence. And fewer still had carried it forward into rebuilding. As America entered the post-war era, life improved dramatically. Cities expanded. Highways were built. Technology advanced. Standards of living rose. And the Mississippi River flowed quietly through a more developed, more managed landscape. But beneath that progress remained a quiet truth. Everything depended on preparation. Everything depended on memory. Because the river had not changed. Only the systems around it had. By the time the survivors reached old age, many of them spoke less about what they had lost and more about what they had learned. That nature is not an enemy. But it is not predictable. That human systems are powerful. But not absolute. And that survival is never guaranteed. Only earned. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 eventually became history. Written in books. Studied in engineering courses.